Great, so welcome to all of you. So this is going to be a good one, but friends, there are so many things we can cover on this topic when we think about the digital public square and its impact on democracy. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of themes that can ground us as we think about the role of these spaces and the questions of governance and accountability for them. Now, in theory, of course, there's many places that could serve as our digital public square, places we could come together to share information about news and events, get into political discussions and debates. And this concept is, inspired by this idea of the agora in Greek cities, which was kind of a public square that would be in most cities that was also a marketplace and a place for commerce, for public trials, religious festivals, and philosophical and political debate. And what we have today is different than that mythologized, Mediterranean square with people in togas talking about big issues. And functionally, I'd say, really when we're talking about the digital public square, we're thinking about our social media platforms, which are run by, private companies who've captured an astonishing amount of engagement. 82% of Canadians are on Facebook, 62% are on Instagram, and so the reach of these social media networks, platforms, really make them the new public square and make conversations about governance so essential. 2 points just to think about as we move to talking about that, though. One, and I'm sure this is an element that many in the room have thought about, which is the question of how do these social media technologies impact how we experience politics? How do they shape our cognition when it comes to how we think about political speech and democracy, and particularly how it helps us conceptualize folks on the other side of the debate along with those on our side? And this is that classic Marshall McLuhan quote, "The medium is the message," right? And it's important we keep that in mind. We impact these technologies, but in turn, they impact us, and they train the political parts of our brain. And what is that impact? Well, one of my favorite articles that folks may be familiar with around this subject was from The Atlantic, from Jonathan Haidt, someone who's talked a lot and spoken a lot about psychology and politics. And that article was called, "Why Have the Last Years Been So Uniquely Stupid?" which was the first time for me reading somebody from a psychological perspective, breaking down in a very clinical way the nature of these technologies and how it impacts our political culture. And basically he argues, something I think many of us are aware of now, that these engagement machines really elevate the loudest and most extreme voices, because that outrage and the other emotions it brings on pushes engagement. They make the other side of the debate seem extreme, unreasonable, and fundamentally opposed to our values. But also, they can be a form of self-censorship machines, because people quickly learn the cost of dissent. That if you question your own side on a political issue, you can be canceled, you can be censored, you can be kind of kicked out or shunned from your political tribe. So it builds a type of groupthink around issues where the loudest voices, which many times are extreme positions, are what we all crowd around, even if they're more extreme than what the average folk actually believes on a political issue. So that's that idea of, what is it doing to our minds and our psychology? The second piece for us to cover and think about is, who has power in these spaces, right? We can see that power disproportionately lies with the billion-dollar firms that run these spaces and have self-interest in engagement over anything else, in attracting eyeballs, and if turning politics into a full-contact blood sport brings more engagement, then for them, bring it on. But these owners don't just have market incentives. At the same time, they have their own political agendas. I think many people here maybe noticed a difference in X when it changed ownership, when a certain somebody bought Twitter and changed what was happening on the background of the platform and the types of comments and discourse that rose up to the top. But there's also actors from different places. There's foreign governments. We've read about troll farms. A new thing I learned about in the last few weeks is clipping, where private marketing firms go through Discord and hire thousands of citizens to post different issues that are not really things that they care about passionately, but things that they're trying to create a viral moment around. And general kind of trolls who just have a disproportionate impact in the space. And so when you think of all of these actors, all the different places of power as an individual citizen in the space, and you realize the tenor and content that the political square is moving in, it can get a little bit scary. And so it really then makes it behooves us to think about governance of these technologies, to think about who should be the ones to really push for them to be democratic spaces, who has the legitimacy to do that, who should do it, because we've seen at any slight move towards regulation, there can be calls of stifling free speech, and also the companies can, have serious acts of retribution. Do we remember when we used to be able to read Canadian news on Facebook? And that was taken from us, right? They have such market share, they can simply pull away services if they don't like the direction. So that's what we're going to get into in this panel. We're going to think about how these platforms work, we're going to think about how power manifests, and think about what it means to bring governance and accountability into those spaces. So before we jump right in, if you haven't had a chance, we have our poll there. Oh, we've got 100%. I think it's the first time today. 100% of folks agree with one position. Take a moment. Oh, we only have 2 respondents. Okay, that's why. So please take a moment. Let us know what you think about the digital public square today and what worries you from a democratic perspective. Oh, there we go. We're up to 75%. And as you're doing that, we're going to have some opening remarks from all of our panelists. Shlomit, maybe we'll start with you. And the question is, when you hear the phrase digital public square, what does that mean to you today? And what should we be paying attention to in that area at the moment?
Thank you for that question. First of all, I'm just going to acknowledge it's a little strange that I'm the CEO of an organization that's called Digital Public Square and has been for over a decade. But we're going to talk about the digital public square as a concept, and so I'm going to try to not be reactive when we bash it, because I suspect that's what we're going to do. To me, digital public square as a concept is an aspiration. It's something that we don't yet have. We have yet to create it. And I think that the fact that people engage online and think that they are engaging in a digital public square is highly problematic. And a lot of our issues stem from that, right? And when I think of a public square, and for some reason I always think about Italy, when I think of a public square, that's a place where people physically come to encounter one another, different people, different lived experiences, to encounter and to share space together, right? Figure out how to share space together. And when you think about our digital public square, we're not maximizing for encountering, right? We're maximizing for engagement. And if you think about it, we're maximizing for engagement with the square, right? Like it's not about let's engage together and walk away to somewhere else. That's not what the platforms are trying to foster, right? It's stay in that square, engage in that square. And so to me, digital public square is a challenge, right? It is a call to action. It is something we need to create.
I love that idea that it's an aspirational concept. It reminds me also what Ian was speaking about with the house that gets deconstructed and actually becomes a prison. This idea that it's trying to trap you in engagement for as long as possible. Beatrice, from your perspective, what do you think when you hear that phrase, and what should we really be paying attention to right now?
I really like that you brought up the Agora, because when I think of public square, that's the first thing I think of. And, it was a real, I'm a pedantic historian by training, so it was a real historical place. It was the heart of civic life. It was commercial, it was sacred, it was democratic, and it's where people came together in communion around these different aspects of society. And I think a very specific thing when I think of digital public square, I think about how the Agora was designed. It was designed for those functions. It was designed for this to be the beating heart of civic life. And right now, when we think of the digital platforms that we use, they were not designed for that function. And it makes me think, how could we design them for pro-social ends, to be supportive of democracy, to be the aspirational digital public square that Shlomit was talking about?
Great. Yeah, I look forward to us getting into, how can we reconfigure these platforms to reach more democratic ends? But before we get to there, Helen, what are your thoughts around the phrase digital public square? And what do you think is the priority for folks to think about when they're, grappling with this concept?
I'm going to bring in the Gen Z perspective.
That's very welcome. Thanks.
I'm part of Gen Z. I do a lot of work with Gen Z and younger populations. And I think that they occupy a unique relationship with the digital public square. I think for a lot of young people who have grown up with digital platforms, the digital public square is both mediated and relational. So we see people engaging in online spaces as a way to find community, to form their identity, to access services, to access community. But we also see it as a place of addiction, of loneliness, of confrontation and polarization. And because the digital public square for young people can be so different, it can be so great for community and so enabling for their own self-development. And it can be this place of strife. We need to start thinking about how we should hold the people who engage in those spaces accountable, how we design those spaces to be safe, to enable the positive and minimize the risks, and to really figure out what values our digital public space in Canada actually reflects.
Great. So building on this question of design, maybe I'm going to do some individual questions now. Beatrice, going to you, when we think about, we've talked about some of the pitfalls and the issues with the current design of the digital public square. But to take it in a different direction, from your research, what are your learnings about what could make a healthier digital public square? Are there ways to democratize this technology?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that, I think it's interesting that this panel is called unmoderated, because I think when we talk about legislation or regulation or redesigning our digital public squares, the focus is often on moderation, and the focus then becomes on concerns about limiting free speech and freedom of speech. But I think there's so much fantastic research now into pro-social design that instead of saying it's about restriction, it's about creating more robust, energetic, enlivening, community-focused spaces, and we can do that through lots of different ways, including, nitty-gritty like rate limiting. So the concern that you talked about astroturfing, so the concern about inauthentic behavior online, and we're in Alberta, so I'll mention we have a project called SAMBOT, where we look at abuse directed towards candidates in different Canadian elections, and we studied the 2023 Alberta provincial election and saw evidence of bots, like mass bot activity in this election. There's a very simple design solution, which is that you could have rate limits. So an account, a person, a device couldn't post mass on scale to flood the zone and create the sort of distortion that we see happen in these spaces with inauthentic engagement, but also power users, so one extremely loud voice. So if we go back to the idea of the public square, you don't have one person with a giant microphone shouting at everybody while nobody else could hear any of the other speakers. Those are that's just one simple design solution, but there's so much great research now that there are these great solutions that we could just implement, but we're not, because there's no incentive.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go. Is there an incentive for these private companies to move in that direction, or is it something that has to be legislated?
It has to be legislated. If there was an incentive, it would have happened already, because we do have great evidence now to implement these sort of pro-social design structures into platforms. And whether or not it's true, there is a belief that engagement only happens from divisive content and extremist content, and that engagement cannot be sort of captured through, or the sort of engagement that digital platforms are looking for can't be captured through these sort of pro-social designs. So you have to incentivize it. There has to be a reason for them to implement that.
And can we do it as, a single domestic market of 40 million folks, or is this something that would need global action to actually, get these companies to make those design choices and changes?
I mean, I think we have great models of around the world of areas doing that. The DSA in the EU is making really big strides. We can enact a duty of care legislation. It was a version of it, an imperfect version, but a version of it was on the books, and we can pursue that. And, you know, Mark Carney has been talking a lot about aligning with other middle powers to accomplish things in collaboration. We can collaborate and get great examples from the EU of how to really enact and then enforce this type of legislation.
Great, thank you. Helen, I want to move to asking you a few questions. And so let's talk more about youth. You know, kind of own that Gen Z perspective. You know, I'm coming from a millennial perspective, and I think, you know, people like me who lived in both worlds, the kind of pre-online and post, like, that's no longer happening. All young people moving forward will live in a place where the baseline is the digital world, is the digital public square. And so, you know, I think it's so critical for us to think about, as you said, centering really young people's experience there. And people have been talking about it a lot. And one of the things we're hearing a lot about is about restricting them from these spaces, from social media. I believe Wab Kinew was one of the first Canadian political leaders to kind of, you know, put a flag down and say, yes, banning it for social media for those under 16 is something we're going to try to push for. I'm not sure if it can be done provincially, but he's at least, you know, put it into the conversation. So, question is, when you think about bans on access to social media for those under 16, is this going to help young people? Would restricting their access make a healthier digital public square? What impacts on democracy would there be if we limited a whole group of the population, those folks, as you said, who it's a native environment for them, from using it until they become 16?
This question has been on my mind a lot recently, as the idea of social media bans has gained traction provincially, as you mentioned, also federally, and also globally in jurisdictions like Australia, throughout the EU, potentially in the UK also. And I understand why people gravitate towards it, why policymakers specifically gravitate towards it, because it's politically legible, right? These spaces are unsafe for young people, so limit their access or don't allow them to actually be part of that unsafe environment. They're also legible because they use the same logic that we are used to with age rating films or having a drinking age, or basically these easy ways to identify a problem and then identify a solution to address it. But those things kind of allied this broader consideration about the importance of access to online spaces for young people. We just heard about homophily and about coming to sameness or being attracted to spaces that provide some type of similarity to you. And for a lot of people, especially young people, who don't necessarily have that community where they live in offline spaces. I'm thinking about people I've worked with who are part of the LGBTQ community or are part of other marginalized groups who don't see themselves or their values reflected where they live. They go to online spaces to actually help with identity formation, to gain community, to feel safe in themselves and who they are. Accessing that is incredibly harmful to young people. I also think there's a question about displacement. So if we're not allowing young people to access social platforms, they will go to potentially less moderated spaces, right? The big platforms at least nominally need some type of safety mechanism. And lastly, I think social media bans, to Beatrice's point, allied this design problem that we have on social media platforms, where we're trying to regulate pieces of content rather than the systems themselves that make things dangerous or unsafe for people.
No, it's a great point about alternative spaces. Reminds me of an article I read about parents tried to restrict their daughter from access to digital platforms, only to find out that she'd found a way to use the fridge to access them because it was one of these wired fridges. So young people are infinitely resourceful and will find ways. But then if protection is important for young people in these spaces, what are some of the ways that we can create that safety without outright bans?
Mm-hmm.
So across the UK in particular, there's this thing called age-appropriate design, where you look at the infrastructure, the architecture of a platform, and you say, okay, what are the things on that platform that are actually creating the danger? So things like attention maximization, infinite scroll, like counts, addressing the things that actually cause addiction, that basically make the business model work, right? Keep people on longer because they're more potentially attracted to sensational content or polarizing content. And we need to get to those kind of architectural changes, not to individual pieces of content and regulating those.
Great. So picking up this theme around, the architecture of these technologies. Shlomit, I know you've done work into how these spaces impact our perceptions of each other, around how they build or undermine feelings of empathy and connectedness, especially across issues. So talk to us a little bit about how these platforms shape our perceptions, and most critically, are there ways to deploy the technology that actually increases understanding and respectful exchange of ideas between people who come from different sides of an issue?
I'll start maybe first with the perception. I absolutely think they shape our perception, and I think about this a lot. There's the people problem, or I shouldn't say problem. There's the people issue, right? Like the personal tendencies of us as human beings, and then there's the platform behavior. And to me, the most fascinating thing is where those things meet and sort of feed each other, right? Polarization is older than everyone in the room, right? Like it goes back way before platforms, and people need community, right? I mean, we've been talking about this as a solution, right? People need belonging, people need community. Guess what? When people feel threatened, they need community even more. They entrench even deeper into their community. And, and your community looks great to you, your community is important to you, and guess what? Increasingly, the other community doesn't look so great, right? This process of thinking more positively about my community and more negatively, let's call it in-group and out-group, right? That sort of ensues. And communities grow further apart, right? And you start to signal to your community, hey, this is, I'm in the right place and follow me. And equally the others do. And I think the scary part about the platforms is that the platforms show us the most extreme version of the out-group, of the other community, and also an outsized, you get the feeling that everybody is part of that, right? And we know there's so much evidence of actually what percentage of people online are creating the content that we all perceive is the majority, right? And so time and time again, sorry, I know that's a long answer. Time and time again, we have found in our research, people's perception of how much we are actually polarized is greater than what we actually are. And I also want to say this, I think it's important. I believe the issue is not even polarization, ideological polarization, or difference of opinion on an issue. That is not the thing that's concerning, right? The concerning part is your perception of how polarized we are, and the concerning part is once you start coloring someone who has an opinion on a specific issue as the enemy, discounting the 9 out of 10 things that we share.
And so are there solutions within the platforms to kind of shake that narrative, to kind of make people question that cognitive model they're building of the out tribe, of the other, to see that kind of humanity or see the nuance in the other side of the debate?
So I think there are many, going to Beatrice's point here, I think there are many things that can be done. First of all, I think they fall into 3 buckets. I absolutely think we have to go after the platforms and demand change. That is, yes, that's legislation, but also let's look to some of the lawsuits that are finally starting to come out, right? That is new. That didn't happen 2 years ago. Nobody was succeeding to get their day in court with Meta. And so this past year, things are moving and shifting. So I absolutely think we have to demand change of the platforms. I absolutely think there's an issue here with digital literacy, with educating people, educating children about, about how these platforms work and the manipulation of them. And then I absolutely agree with Zane's point from this morning, which is we need to fill the void. Like, we can't stay out of the game. We can create spaces that are positive spaces where people can engage. We have done that in our work several times, and I'm not selling it as a solution to everything, right? But it is possible when you create spaces where you allow people to air their grievances, where you show people different perspectives. You do it when people can engage in a way that is sort of non-judgmental, when people can engage without their entire community watching what they're doing, right? I think there are many, many ways that we can create spaces that will maximize for, these things that we care about: trust, dialogue, inclusion, engagement with a human being, not with the platform.
Maybe to that, and a question for all of you. Yeah, what is that balance? Helen, you talked about the importance of building community and folks who may not have that community locally, but are there practices or ways that we can really weave in kind of in-person interaction and community building with these platforms, and they can have more of a synergistic relationship with each other where they're promoting that in-person dialogue and vice versa? The online platform is helping you get connected more deeply to other folks. And like, how do we do that? How do we put those two forms of community building together in a way that's mutually beneficial to both?
Can I jump in on this? Shlomit has heard me talk about this before, but I am really excited that I feel like the conversation has started to shift in the past year or so, where the importance and value of public interest digital platforms has started to percolate more. And we do have really interesting examples of this that we could build for a Made in Canada approach. So in Vermont, there's a digital platform called Front Porch Forum. And the idea is it's exactly that. It helps connect people within their community to each other, and they specifically describe themselves as the compost for online communities. So they're helping to build and grow offline communities with this online presence. So I think one thing we haven't really realized, that there are large areas of Canada that have lost access to local news, and so they are completely dependent specifically on Meta, specifically on Facebook, to get access to community news. This is particularly dangerous in places and examples like when there's wildfires and they cannot access links to information about what's happening in their community. The need to know your neighbor's numbers, going back to Zara, is incredibly important. But what if we had a digital platform that was not based on maximizing engagement, but was actually with the aim of helping people learn about civic engagement going on in their community, maybe had an built-in deliberative platform that is a space where people can share policy ideas, and then the technology helps uplift the ideas that have the most community buy-in and engagement, and bring together things that people across differences actually care and have shared ideas about. That technology exists. It's been used really usefully in Taiwan. There's a V-Taiwan platform that we could look to. But it's just very exciting, and I think that there's so much space to move in this new direction.
Yeah, I love this concept of kind of crowdsourcing good public policy through these platforms.
One thing I think that's also really important, it goes in both directions, right? Can we engage online, be the compost, love that, for the in-person, or rather, can we engage online? And, I think that's another thing we need to think about. We talk a lot about dialogue. I am definitely a in-the-room dialogue kind of person. Not everybody, that's not for everyone, right? There are people that will never enter the room, right? Whether I like that or not. And so we also need solutions for them. And that, I think, is where the online space comes in. And so ideally, can we get some people with some level of engagement online, and the people who are willing to step into the room? But I also want to talk about the other direction, right? I've sat in dialogue sessions where you see this magic happening, and all I think about is, how can you scale that? How can you translate that? And I'll give a nod to Professor Ann Wilson, who's a social psychologist and has worked with us on a few things. She talks a lot about efficacy, about how it's really important on very divisive issues to show to everyone out there that there are people crossing boundaries, whatever the boundary is, because there's something about just the efficacy, like knowing, oh, when you look at that and you're like, oh, that's possible. Look, there are people out there doing it. Perhaps I can also jump in. And so I think it's really important. There's a whole body of work in social psychology that has been there for so many years that I think should be applied online.
Helen.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add. Over the last 8 months, I ran a project called Gen Z AI, which was a national youth consultation on AI and online harms. And I'm raising it because it does basically what Shlomit just mentioned. It coupled both in-person dialogue with what we called a civic dialogue online. So we partnered with an organization called make.org out of France to take the policy recommendations that were drafted by young people in a room together across the country to 10,000 other Canadian youth through the platform to upvote, to downvote, to add amendment to challenge. And we ended up with a series of 17 legislative proposals for AI governance and online harms governance that we presented directly to the AI Minister and the Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture just a couple weeks ago. So we saw a really good case study with this methodology that I and my co-lead Fergus Lindley-Moda developed that is doing exactly what you're talking about, kind of having these in-person forums. We did them in Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Vancouver, to have that engagement, that deep deliberation, and then pair that with scope and reach so that we really got a representative sample of what young people want for AI governance and online harms governance in the country. So I think with this innovation in method of dialogue, we can come to not only policy recommendations that can help our digital public square thrive, but also create spaces for people to become kind of these democratic warriors who understand that they can be civically engaged in different ways and that they can all lead to these really productive ends.
Just to say, to underline the value of that, because I think not only does it make people feel like they have a voice and a say, they can also see how their input interacts with the input of other people who are on that platform, who are sharing their opinions. What is a shared opinion? What is maybe not as popular? But it gives them an authentic sense of where Canadians stand on these policy issues, which is like a strong contrast to what we have right now, which is an information ecosystem where people are getting very warped ideas of where Canadians stand on policy. And a concern is that policymakers and elected officials are going online and getting a very inauthentic understanding of where Canadians stand. So just to highlight the value of the work that Helen.
Yeah, that's so dope, actually, that model, like 10,000 young people contributing to policy. And as you said, it reminds me when I didn't live in Canada for a little bit, and I would read the comment section in the Globe and Mail to try to get a feel for what was going on in Canada. I'm like, everyone has lost their minds. Like, because you just simply, you get a very biased sample that doesn't give you a real understanding of where most people are at. So I know we're pretty much at time. So just one last question, rapid fire, because I think many people, I love the direction we're in, which is really positive and thinking about these models that we can engage more Canadians in policy discussions and crafting solutions. So for folks in the audience that are really curious about this and want to learn about some of these new models or techniques, is there one, you mentioned before, Beatrice, front porch, but is there, maybe if each person could mention maybe either one platform that people could look into, or if not a platform, a website or an article that people who want to go deeper in understanding how we can utilize this to really strengthen and expand democratic debate, where people can start for their own kind of homework.
I'll start. So actually, Front Porch Forum has inspired a public interest organization in the United States called Roundabout, and the idea is to scale this and to make this available and adaptable by different communities. And I think that we should have a Canadian version of it, but you can look into Roundabout. And also, if you're interested in learning more about what the research on pro-social design says the pro-social design network is a fantastic treasure trove of that to understand that there are actionable solutions.
I second that second point. And then I'll just mention we've recently used in a project that was about urban development, so very different, but we tried to have some sort of deliberative process to allow people to engage and to offer their opinion in 3 different cities. And we used, and I think I'm sharing one that most people, or at least in our space, are familiar with, Polis, which has been used extensively, and it's an open source kind of platform. And so we used that. We actually embedded that within our platform that was there to dispel sort of misconceptions about urban development, and then allowed people to share what they think, what are their priorities. And again, it's a tool that allows to surface shared priorities across issue sets, and I would just recommend looking into that. That's work that comes, if anyone wants to learn more about some of these processes, definitely look at what Taiwan does, definitely a country that is a leader in this space.
Yeah, and I would say Gen Z AI, what I just mentioned. We have 5 reports on the outcomes of the process that include our methodology. You can access that on the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy's website, or on the Dialogue on Technology Project's website out of SFU. We were partners for the project, and it kind of shows the ways in which we engaged in each of our cities with our in-person participants, but also how we were able to extend that reach and scope and impact of the project.
Love it. Thank you so much, Beatrice, Shlomit, Helen. Thank you both for all the insights you shared today, but also for the really vital and important work you're doing for our country. And can we please give our panelists a loud and warm round of applause? And I encourage you all to look up their bios, look up their organization, and be in dialogue with them today. Thank you.